Hi, everybody. I'm going to try to present this in a brief format. It always goes longer than I expect, but today's presentation is about classical conditioning. And the reason I bring this up and spend so much time with it is because there's a lot of misconceptions about what classical conditioning is and isn't. And everybody knows about Pavlov and you know a lot of the terminology. But the critical thing I want you to pay attention to in this presentation is really what exactly is learned. It's not what a lot of people think it is. And I want to be real clear about it because I'm going to be expecting very specific explanations of it. So you should have access to the PowerPoint slides I'm sharing right now. So basically classical conditioning, Pavlov, Little Albert, similar. Lots of different terms for classical conditioning have been used over the years. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but classical conditioning is what most people refer to it in the popular literature. More behavioral focused folks, people who really study classical conditioning, usually refer to it as Pavlovian conditioning. Skinner at one time referred to it as type 2 learning, and then other folks will refer to it as respondent conditioning. So classical conditioning, whenever we talk about learning, I try to focus first of all on what is it that's being learned on an abstract level, if nothing else. So the misconception, and that's why I have a big knot here, the misconception is that classical conditioning is a stimulus response learning process, but it is not. You are not tying a stimulus to a response. What's actually happening in classical conditioning is a learning of two stimuli being connected. So it's a stimulus to stimulus learning process. In the end, what the prevailing view of how to best explain this is referred to as an expectation of a stimulus arrival, meaning I have information in the world now that stimulus A is predicting the occurrence of stimulus B. So to use Pavlov's model, just that most people have understanding of, you don't learn to salivate, you learn to salivate because you expect the food to arrive. So what that means is in Pavlov's classic experiment, where he had a bell or a tone or a metronome, depending on which version of the study you want to reference or think about, a sound became associated with the presentation of meat powder to the dogs. And the dogs salivate because they have meat powder in their mouths. And what they eventually learned to do was that when the tone or the bell or the metronome made the sound, that sound was highly predictive of the presentation of the meat powder. So whenever the dog heard the bell, the dog predicted or knew, had understanding that meat powder was coming. Because the meat powder was coming, they generated a salivation response. They didn't learn to salivate because of the sound per se. They learned that the meat powder's coming because of the sound. And then they salivated because they thought meat powder was coming. So it's a very minor difference, but it's really critical to making an explanation of what's really being learned here. And what's being learned is the connection between the sound and the meat powder in Pavlov's experiment. Now, this leads to some key terms. Now, unfortunately, knowing all these key terms leads to an expectation that all these things are necessarily present. And here's what I want to get very clear. The only time you absolutely must have an unconditioned stimulus for a classical conditioning situation is if you're doing an experiment where you need to prove that a stimulus to stimulus connection has been made. We make classical conditioning associations all the time. But we don't always have salivation or eye blink or flinching or things like that, these unconditioned responses that come with unconditioned stimuli. I know that the next song on my favorite playlist is coming because the end of the prior song is wrapping up. And every time I hear the end of that prior song, the next thing that's coming, I can predict. That's a stimulus to stimulus pairing. And that's true classical conditioning. But I can't prove it in a lab because there's no behavioral observation, at least in the classic ways that we like to do this. So I'm going to explain it from the perspective of the experimentation model, and that's how it's always presented in your basic textbooks. But I want you to recognize that two stimuli can be paired. We just may not actually be able to observe a behavioral indication of those stimulus pairings. So anyway, the key terms that most of these have been presented to you in your Psych 100 class back in undergrad or even high school days. You have an unconditioned stimulus, and I want to highlight real quickly this. People get stumbling on the words. Oops, did not mean to do that. They get stumbled on the words, but the main thing I want you to pick up on is conditioned equals learned. Because we're using old language, conditioning, classical conditioning, conditioning is just an old term for learning in psychology. So whenever you see the term conditioned, it means it's a learned situation. Unconditioned means unlearned or didn't need to be learned. It was already pre-existing. So an unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that leads to a natural response or an unconditioned response. No learning is required for a response to occur to the unconditioned stimulus because we already do it naturally. The unconditioned response is a simple, natural response that follows an unconditioned stimulus. So when I put meat powder in a dog's mouth, the dog salivates. When I puff air into your eyeball, you blink. When I poke you, you flinch, things like that. Those are unconditioned stimuli, unconditioned responses. Those are just there in, as I said, in a classical conditioning experiment, just to let you prove that a stimulus has occurred. A neutral stimulus is a stimulus that has no automatic response following it, and it has no prediction attached to it yet. What that means is it's a stimulus in the environment that has no outcome. And in traditional classical conditioning situations, the neutral stimulus is the thing that we present to see if we can train someone to make the pairing. So in Pavlov's example, I ring a bell, has no impact on the dogs. The conditioned stimulus is the exact same stimulus as the neutral stimulus after it has been paired to something. What's it been paired to? The unconditioned stimulus. That's it. The training leads to me picking up that the conditioned stimulus is predictive of the occurrence of the unconditioned stimulus. And finally, a conditioned response, which doesn't have to happen necessarily for classical conditioning to have taken place, is a response that follows a conditioned stimulus. It's behaviorally the same thing as what an unconditioned response would be. So in Pavlov's model, the dogs salivate. But what's different is what elicited the salivation. So in this case, the conditioned response is salivation after the presentation of a bell. Why is it salivating? It's salivating because the conditioned stimulus is predicting the unconditioned stimulus, meaning the dog thinks they're going to get meat powder, but the actual response itself is the salivation. A couple of other key terms here that are pretty important when we're talking about these things. Discrimination means that I'm able to distinguish between two similar stimuli. So one bell can lead to a pairing, but I can recognize that a different bell means something different completely. So, a fire alarm versus a doorbell, that kind of thing. Generalization is, even though there are two distinct sounds, maybe I make those all mean the same thing. So two different doorbells will lead to the same kind of response from my dog. If I see a dog in a natural environment and I have been bitten by a dog before, I may very well generalize all dogs are fearful and make that generalization. You see this a lot in clinical situations, by the way, where we overgeneralize. There's one scary thing that we've developed a phobia to, and we generalize it to other things that are similar to it. Maybe you have been stung by bees and you see other flying insects and you react adversely because of that prior experience with the bees. So flies can make you jittery or scared as well. That's a generalization. And finally, desensitization is something that we study in classical conditioning models, because what that goal in desensitization is to get you to reduce the predictive tie between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. So that you won't necessarily have a negative adverse reaction when you shouldn't have it. And this is one way to train phobias away. What you do is you have gradually greater levels of exposure to what has become a fearful stimulus in safe conditions. So you start off with a spider. Maybe you have a fear of spiders that because you've made an association presumably between spider and something fearful. And so that spider, in order to become desensitized to this severe phobia to spiders, you start off with spider presentation in a cage across the room, and then over time closer and closer to the point where you recognize that mere vision of a spider doesn't necessarily have to lead to a panic attack. So then again, I'm going to repeat this. What is learned in this situation? When two stimuli occur together, usually in rapid succession pairing, frequently enough or reliably enough, and when I say reliably enough, if the conditioned stimulus is very unusual or surprising, right? There's a very unique visual, auditory, or smell that doesn't occur in any other condition except for when the unconditioned stimulus that I'm trying to pair it to arises. You don't have to have quite so many pairings for something that is that surprising. Anyway, when I have two stimuli that get paired together reliably, an association is formed, is the term we use. It's association learning, meaning the two stimuli become linked in some way. Basically, it's a cognitive linking. Behaviorists don't like that explanation, but it has become the dominant way of referring to it. Is what we'll refer to as expectancy theory, where the expectation of the unconditioned stimulus is raised because the conditioned stimulus so frequently, so reliably predicts the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus. So that association has been made. These things have been paired. Therefore, the CS predicts the US is about to be presented or is coming. And this, if there is a US automatically leads to a UR. This elicits a response because the US is anticipated. When the US is present, the response is called unconditioned response. When the US is not present, it is called the conditioned response. Now, again, I want to just reiterate, it's possible to have two stimuli that get paired where neither of them are a US. Just have two stimuli that are highly likely to occur together. Then I know that when I see stimulus 1, stimulus 2 is likely to come. But I may not have a behavioral response because stimulus 2 has no natural follow-through. But those two things can still be paired. Now, some people will often want to know what's the difference between a conditioned response and an unconditioned response. Let's say you have one of those situations where there is an unconditioned stimulus in the situation. And what's the difference between the conditioned and the unconditioned response? Really, there's only a couple of things. First of all, for the conditioned response to exist, it has to be in a condition where there is no unconditioned stimulus. So basically, it's the stimulus that is elicited the response is first difference between conditioned and an unconditioned response. The second thing, more important, is the strength of the response is usually greatest when you're talking about an unconditioned response because the meat powder's in the dog's mouth already, right? So the salivation has to be there in order to break down the presumed food. A conditioned response is a preparatory response for the expectation that I'm going to get meat powder or food or whatever. So it's not quite as strong, but it's a startup. So the strength of the response is stronger for the unconditioned response. And then finally, the durability of the response is greater for an unconditioned response compared to a conditioned response. Specifically, for conditioned responses, extinction is possible. This is how we can train you to no longer have phobias or to reduce the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder. So, classic criticism with things like this is like, who cares? Where does it exist? I don't need to teach my dog to salivate, things like that. So can we use this in real life? Operant conditioning, we'll talk about in a different video, is obvious. I can teach people how to do specific things and train my dog, etc. But where does classical conditioning exist in real life? And generally, what we talk about it is with conditioned emotional responses. One of the more common places where we see classical conditioning is in responses to emotional stimuli, phobias, anxiety, fear, even enjoyment, attitudes towards school and work, and things like that. All of these can be explained through a conditioned emotional response, which is a stimulus-to-stimulus pairing. So for instance, anxiety. If you get anxious in certain settings because in prior instances of being in that setting, something fearful happened, then that will lead to an anxiety response. You can have pleasant feelings as well. Like a lot of people are very pleased to be in their kindergarten classrooms because their teachers are so nice and lovely. That will make you have a joyful response in that room, or a happy feeling in that room. Or when you smell the smells of, your grandmother's house. That's, a generally positive place for you, then you're going to have a positive experience. But, and other smells can have negative impacts for individuals. For instance, children who have been abused by an alcoholic parent, for instance, may smell alcohol and have a fearful response because maybe they've been abused in the past at higher rates when alcohol was present, things like that. Anyway, this conditioned emotional response comes from the work of J.B. Watson and Little Albert, and you've probably seen some instances of that work before, where Albert was presented with, a rat or a rabbit and things like that, and then they make a loud noise in the presence of the animal, which startled Little Albert, who was a toddler. I think he was 18 months or so, actually younger. But anyway, the pairing of that loud clap and the presentation of an animal that had no impact on him in the past was generating a fearful response to the animal. And what happened in that instance is the animal, visual stimulus, was paired with a fearful sound. He couldn't see what was causing the sound. It was an iron bar being struck by a hammer right behind his head. That led to a fear response caused by the sound, but then it gets attributed to the presentation of the animal, and then you develop a fear from that. Anyway, that's classical conditioning, pairing of two stimuli. That's really all it is. You get two things connected, and sometimes it leads to a behavioral response. In that case, there has been an unconditioned stimulus in place. But the really important part is the pairing of two stimuli. Have a good day.